Hey gang, it's Squill, and we finally made it. The Fionna and Cake episode I've been the most excited to talk about. Jerry is the 8th episode of Fionna and Cake, and sort of the transitional point in the miniseries. It is our final multiverse hopping episode, and the one to transition us into the series endgame. I have a lot to say about this one, so let's get into it. The episode opens up on a Simon and Betty flashback as they go on an expedition that we learn more about later in the episode. Compared to later Simon and Betty flashbacks, I don't really have a ton to say about this scene, but it's definitely cute. And I love the way this warm, wholesome flashback is contrasted against the harsh, empty wasteland that Fionna, Cake, and Simon find themselves in. This episode acts as the emotional low point for our three main characters, and them being stuck in a barren wasteland is a good visual metaphor for that. The episode puts a pretty heavy rift between Fionna and Cake, as Cake still holds a grudge against her for bailing on the vampire world. Fionna is definitely the more sympathetic of the two, as she just doesn't want Cake to get hurt or killed. However, Cake's anger is also understandable, as she's felt underestimated for the entire series. After the title card, we get a brief scene of Scarab stuck in a cosmic waiting room. I love the designs for all of the cosmic beings waiting here alongside Scarab. It's in this scene that we're also introduced to Orbo, the most based character in all of fiction. We cut back to Fionna and Simon sitting by a campfire. Tom Kenny and Madeline Martin both give such excellent performances here. They both do such an excellent job making their characters sound so raw and vulnerable. It was also nice seeing Fionna and Simon bond some more as Simon tells her about his relationship with Betty. The scene begins with Simon giving a presentation about mystical artifacts, and I love how all of the objects seen here are from the original show, such as the Armor of Zeldaron from Blood Under the Skin, the Wand of Disbursement from Sons of Mars, or the Porcelain Lamb from Beyond This Earthly Realm. It really makes you think about what items from the original show are also artifacts from the pre-Mushroom War era. Like, what about the Glasses of Nerdicon from the Real You? Or the Crystal Gem Apple from Tree Trunks? Oh, or what about the Magic Beans from the Pods? Or the Freaky Eyeballs from Don't Look? And I could go on like this forever, so I should probably stop myself here. Anyways, as Simon describes his plan to find the Enchiridion, the crowd continues to make fun of him, with Betty being the only one taking him seriously. After the lecture is over, Betty goes to talk to Simon about a discovery she's made. The scenes we get between Simon and Betty throughout the episode hold two major functions. First off, they establish Betty's self-sacrificing nature, as, in this scene for example, she sacrifices her research trip to the Outback to go on an expedition with Simon. This is consistent with Betty's character, as this is the same research trip we learned about in Temple of Mars. She has a codependent relationship with Simon. She views her own life as less valuable than his. From her very first appearance, she sacrificed her old life just to help Simon, all the way to her final main series appearance in which she sacrifices her physical form just to keep Simon safe. Not to mention losing her sanity in between those events. But these scenes also hold another purpose, and that is to get us to care about Simon and Betty's relationship more than we ever could have in the original show. Now, this obviously isn't to say that I didn't care about Simon and Betty in the original show. I cared, but mainly because I just cared about Simon and Betty as individual characters, not quite as much when it comes to their relationship. It's honestly kind of insane how the original show never had a Simon and Betty flashback episode. All we really get is this one scene in Come Along With Me. We never really got a solid understanding of why Betty wanted Simon back so bad. But now, after this episode, I get it. Simon and Betty were basically made for each other. They were the only two people they knew who shared each other's interest, and a bond between them formed because of that. They're two turbo nerds who managed to find each other. I love that. And this just makes Betty's entire arc in the original show so much more compelling and tragic, because now we understand what kind of relationship she was trying to get back. But I've probably rambled about Simon and Betty for way too long now, so let's jump back to present day. Simon's story is interrupted by Cake screaming. While Simon and Fionna were talking, Cake stumbled upon the remains of Finn and Jake's treehouse. where she encounters none other than BMO in disguise. I love BMO's inclusion in this episode because he's somehow able to both bring levity to the situation here, while also making the twist at the end even darker at the exact same time. Obviously, BMO's childlike nature helps lighten the tone a little bit. He brings some much needed comedy to the episode. However, his role in the episode becomes so much more depressing when you realize that he's basically been all on his own for the past 15 years. It's not hard to imagine that in that time, BMO started deluding himself into believing that everyone else was still around. A pretty dark spin on BMO's wild imagination, if you ask me. Although it does make you wonder what happened to other robot characters, such as Nepter or Rattaballs. On a much lighter note, Simon being so happy to see BMO was very wholesome. This is the first time we've seen Simon and BMO interact, but it's nice to imagine the two becoming friends sometime in between Come Along With Me and Fionna and Cake. BMO and Ice King were pretty good friends by the end of the original show, so it's possible that that friendship's maintained even when Ice King became Simon again. Simon asks BMO where this world's crown is, and BMO suggests they look in what used to be the Ice Kingdom. We then cut back to Scarab and Orbo as Orbo reprimands Scarab for doing a bad job. I know this subplot is yet another example of the show kinda downplaying Scarab as a villain, but it's really hard for me to stay mad at it when Orbo is the most based character in all of fiction. There's just something about his simple design and show personality that makes him so dang funny and charming to me. He also has the same voice as Bandit from Bluey, which makes him even funnier to me. Back to the main plot, the gang are on their way to what used to be the Ice Kingdom. When they pass by a cave, BMO mentions that his friend Jerry lives there. This creates some really funny implications when you learn the twist at the end of the episode. While on their way, Simon decides to tell Fionna a bit more about him and Betty. We get a very cute scene of them on their expedition to find the Enchiridion. It would have been cool to see a bit more of their expedition, but the little we do get is very cute. I love how these flashbacks show off a bit more of the nerdy side of Betty's character. This has obviously always been a part of Betty's character, she was a graduate student after all. But it's cool to see that knowledge applied to a non-magical setting. After the flashback, the gang makes it to the Ice Kingdom. Amongst all the junk, Cake finds a briefcase of secret tapes. This was a cool callback to Holly Jolly Secrets. BMO puts it in, and through him we get our second of 2 Ice King scenes in Fionna and Cake. I wish we got to see a few more tapes throughout the episode, as this scene is pretty short. But to be fair, this is a very loaded episode already, and what we do get is still great. After watching the tapes, Fionna begins to feel guilty over wanting Simon to put the crown back on. Fionna's gained sympathy towards Simon tracks with her character development from the past couple episodes, as she's gained more of a conscience when it comes to hurting others. Simon has no luck finding the ice crown, so their only hope is to fix the remote. Luckily, BMO knows Princess Bubblegum, who can fix the remote for them. Fionna's feeling down while on their way to the Candy Kingdom, so Simon decides to tell her more about him and Betty. We then get a scene of Simon and Betty not too long after the expedition, where Simon has become famous for finding the Enchiridion. It was great to get some context for the photo we see in I Remember You. That's honestly something I never thought we'd get. But this scene also shows off a bit more of Betty's self-sacrificing nature, letting Simon take all the glory despite being just as valuable to the expedition. While Simon is clearly upset by her decision, he also could have pushed Betty way harder into joining him. He could have told her how much she means to him and how he wants her by his side, instead of just how important she was to the expedition. Gotta say, if the point in Simon telling Fionna the story was to cheer her up, then he chose probably the worst moment possible. Once Simon finishes, the gang gets to the Candy Kingdom. I really love the design of the decrepit old Candy Kingdom, it feels very ominous. BMO pretending to be Princess Bubblegum is cute and funny, but clearly isn't helping our main characters. This further frustrates Cake, which leads to Fionna running off crying. Simon comforting Fionna here was very sweet and reminiscent of the ways he'd comfort Marceline in Simon and Marcy. And unlike last time, the story Simon tells here actually seems to help Fionna. The story begins a few weeks after the expedition, where Simon looks at a book that Betty checked out in the library. Inside, he finds a letter written by Betty addressed to Simon, describing her distaste towards the book. This was a nice callback to the letter that Simon mentioned back in Broke His Crown. I love the way these flashbacks take little details we knew about Simon and Betty from the original series, and extrapolate a full story from them. It's very rewarding as a longtime fan of the show and of these characters. It was also nice to get confirmation that the letter canonically had the word ass in it. That's very funny. But as Simon keeps reading the letter, it starts to get more personal, describing Betty's true feelings towards Simon. I love the shots of Simon running as we hear Betty's monologue in the background. It feels so dramatic. We get a pretty funny scene between Simon and Betty's roommate before Simon confronts Betty at the bus stop. At first, Simon just tells Betty to be careful about what she leaves in letters, much to Betty's disappointment. This is until Simon stops her from getting on the bus and tells her how he truly feels about her. I love just how romantic this scene is, with the music swelling as Simon and Betty embrace. It's a really beautiful moment. It's interesting that this moment is almost immediately undercut by Fionna asking if Simon got on the bus with her, to which Simon replies no. This idea will be explored more in the finale, but this episode does such a great job at subtly planting the seeds of there being flaws with Simon and Betty's relationship. Simon was never intentionally selfish, however, he was somewhat ignorant to the ways in which Betty would sacrifice herself for him. And Betty had a codependent relationship with Simon, always valuing his life above her own. But at the end of the day, while their relationship is definitely flawed, it's never portrayed as bad or toxic. There were toxic elements to their relationship, certainly, however, they both made each other's lives so much better. In case you couldn't tell, I really love Simon and Betty, and they might be my favorite dynamic out of the entire Adventure Time franchise. BMO is clearly as moved by Simon and Betty's relationship as I am, and offers to jumpstart the remote himself. Gotta say, this was a nice heroic moment for BMO. Using BMO to fix the remote was a very creative solution to the game's problem. But BMO? Do you guys remember BMO's big fake-out death from his titular Distant Land special? And just how messed up it was to see BMO all torn apart like that? But even if it felt like BMO was dying, deep down, we all knew that the show couldn't actually kill off BMO. I mean, it's a BMO. He always bounces back. And lo and behold, he does, and he saves the day in classic BMO fashion. But not here. Even if he's not technically our BMO, he's still basically identical to the one we all know and love. And seeing any version of BMO horrifically die is such a massive tone shift. Like, watching our three main characters bury BMO, the physical embodiment of joy and imagination, really feels like the big all is lost moment for the series. On a bit of a brighter note, I want to point out just how absolutely beautiful the sunset is, creating one of my favorite shots in all of Adventure Time. After the burial, Cake suggests that they go visit Jerry to tell him the bad news. If only they knew. While on their way, Fionna and Cake start singing the Cheers theme, much to Simon's discomfort. It's nice that even in a dire situation, and even after being at each other's throats throughout most of the episode, the two are still able to share a nice moment together like this. Instead of singing the Cheers theme, Cake decides to sing the song she heard back in Fionna Campbell. Simon admits that he forgot Cake even knew that song, to which Fionna asks him what it even is. Simon reveals that this was his and Betty's song, giving us our final flashback as well as my favorite scene in all of Fionna and Cake. I don't think words can describe just how perfect this moment is. Everything about it is absolutely beautiful, and one of my favorite scenes in all of Adventure Time. Everything in You by Half Shy is not only my favorite song in Fionna and Cake, not only my favorite song in Adventure Time, but one of my new favorite songs, period. It's so good. The soft vocals and wistful lyrics reflect Simon and Betty's relationship perfectly. And I highly implore all of you to listen to the full version on the Fionna and Cake soundtrack. Watching Simon and Betty embrace each other with none of the baggage or drama that comes with their relationship is just beautiful. Like, if this isn't the most romantic moment I've seen in anything ever, then I don't know what is. The scene is gorgeous on a visual level too, with the purple lighting and the fireflies surrounding them. And in retrospect, knowing where both Simon and Betty go as characters after this moment, it becomes all the more tragic. Like, this is what Simon and Betty were trying to get back so bad. This is what they were missing. I've probably rewatched this scene hundreds of times by now, and listened to the extended version of the song on its own even more than that, and yet this moment still gets me emotional every time I watch it. It is such a perfect moment of television. The scene at the end of I Remember You is still my favorite Adventure Time moment of all time, however, this is very close behind. Back to present day, in a moment of tonal whiplash, the gang finally gets to Jerry's cave, where they are confronted with none other than the Lich, in what is easily his sickest design in the entire franchise. With the implication that this is the Lich's wish from all the way back in Finn the Human. This means that the wasteland that we've spent the whole episode in is probably identical to the first 4 seasons of the original show. Like, think about it, the events of I Remember You probably just happened at this point. Isn't that wild? Isn't it kind of insane how in 2023, we're still getting payoffs to plot points from Adventure Time episodes that are over 10 years old? And right when I was starting to get fatigued of the Lich constantly showing up in Adventure Time media. At first, I wasn't quite sure how to feel about the Lich being depressed, since I've always kind of seen him as a cold, calculating machine, incapable of complex thought. But I think it works in this context because we are seeing the Lich after accomplishing his goal of exterminating all life. So you can still believe that the Lich is a machine-like force of nature before achieving his goal, but becomes capable of self-reflection after achieving said goal. In a moment of desperation, Fionna reveals that she grabbed the crown from the former Ice Kingdom and has kept it a secret ever since. This is well foreshadowed by the shot of Fionna looking at the Ice King's old drum set, which we saw him put the crown in just moments ago. This is a very good showcase of Fionna's character development, as not only has she grown to care about Simon, but she's come to realize that changing everyone back into their magical selves would be selfish and disrespectful to their own autonomy. Though it does make BMO's death scene a little darker now that we know that Fionna could have easily prevented it by revealing the truth. Fionna basically learned the lesson that Betty should have learned back in Elements. Despite this, Simon still convinces Fionna to let him put on the crown. Afterwards, we see Simon once again try and do the ritual from Simon Petrikov, and Fionna and Cake jump back into his brain. This is when Scarab comes in to presumably kill Simon, when the two are sent away by a mysterious portal. And that was Jerry, and really, what more can I say about this episode? There's a reason why this is far and away my longest Fionna and Cake review so far. Jerry is my favorite Fionna and Cake episode, and one of my favorite Adventure Time episodes, period. It basically captures everything I love about the franchise in 22 minutes. It has strong character interactions between Simon and Fionna, some great comedic relief with BMO's role in the episode, some gorgeous visuals, some fun character designs with Scarab subplot, some great callbacks to earlier episodes, some horror with the Lich and the implications that come with him, and an absolutely wonderful Simon and Betty love story that's topped off with my new favorite song in all of Adventure Time. It truly is a spectacular episode of television, and represents Adventure Time at its absolute best. And with that, we only have 2 episodes of Fionna and Cake left to talk about, the big 2-part finale. My opinions on these episodes have certainly shifted in the weeks they've come out, so they'll be interesting to talk about. But until then, Squill out.